Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by and welcome to the Fraud Awareness in the Era of COVID-19 conference call. At this time, all lines are in a listen-only mode. Later, we'll conduct a question-and-answer session, and instructions will be given at that time. If you need assistance during the call, please press star then 0. And as a reminder, we are recording today. I would now like to turn the conference over to Matt Richardson. Please go ahead, sir.
Great. Thank you, Art. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Matt Richardson from the Treasury Solutions, Citizens Treasury Solutions Group. And on behalf of myself and my colleagues, I'd like to thank you for joining today's session, which is Ready to Fight Fraud. COVID-19 isn't the only virus your business should worry about. Fraud awareness and prevention is always an important topic, and even more so in times of economic stress and uncertainty like now. I did a quick internet search this morning on COVID-related fraud and found among the first page results guidance from the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, the FTC, the FCC, the U.S. Postal Inspectors, and the FBI. So certainly a very timely topic, and we hope there's some good information that will help you and your businesses stay safe. And a programming note, I actually came into the office today due to my speaking role on this call. I wanted to make sure there were no stray, sounds of dogs barking and kids yelling and leaf blowers going off in the neighborhood. And it really illustrated one of the key worries and concerns in times like these, especially when people have been working from home, which is, am I going to fit into my work clothes? Sadly, I got my answer this morning. And I hope for better for all of you. But on with the program, we do have a couple of really good speakers for the call today. John Cruz from Citizens Corporate Security. John is a certified fraud examiner and an access data certified examiner, and he's going to start us off. And then after John, myself and Dave Hughes are going to talk more specifically about some of the cash management tools and techniques that can help combat fraud. Dave runs our commercial card business, and between Dave and I, we cover the full spectrum of commercial payments. So again, thanks for joining, and I'm going to hand it over to John to get us started.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. So as we kind of get into this, I just want to kind of throw out a quick disclaimer. A lot of these slides and a lot of the information that I'm going to be hitting on, please keep in mind these are high points, hot items, things of that nature. And quite honestly, we could do entire presentations on any one of these topics in extended presentations. So a lot of the key things in my presentation here are really to just get folks thinking along the lines of looking internally, thinking about what you're doing from a business perspective, how you're protecting your data, your information, and staying on top of, everything that's bad and evil out there that could affect your company that we see within the industry on a regular basis. So as we kind of go into this, three key things to really think about is, and I always tell everybody, and if we go on to the next slide and get this rolled off here, is we always want to be aware. That, I can't emphasize that enough. Be aware of what's going on. Be aware of what's affecting the industry from a fraud and, fraud awareness and what's the latest and the greatest that's going on out there. So as I get into my presentation, I want to cover off on start with data security. And if we can advance on here to the next slide. So some of the key principles with data security. And again, these are reminders. So it's kind of a flow chart here going from discover to monitor, prevent, control, and extend. And when I use the term discover, that's really an opportunity for a company to look internally and say, okay, let's do a discovery session. Let's see what information do we have that the bad guys may want. And that's going to point you in the right direction as to what you need to be protecting. Then when you get to the monitor phase, you want to look at your data and say, okay, from this data that we want to protect, who uses the data? Is it internal? Is it external? And then it just flows right to prevent. What policies and procedures are needed to effectively secure your data? The key factors in data privacy and data encryption. Is your data encrypted? How are you protecting it, and what steps are you currently taking? And a big part of that comes into control. You certainly want to control your data from being shared in on removable media devices and other means of data exfiltration. So when you're at the beginning of this and you're talking about Discover and you're talking about that data that you want to protect, and you're kind of walking this process, think about, okay, how could that be stolen from our company? How could somebody take that data? How can that information then be used against the company? And certainly the last one here on extend is you want to look at the data that you're trying to protect and look at the environment. Look at your entire environment and how are you protecting that from device to device, device to cloud. And I know a lot of companies are looking to move to cloud and cloud platforms. And quite honestly, that brings with it a whole host of additional security measures that need to be looked at. And it kind of plays in part with all of today's environment. Because with a lot of the work from home settings that we're all teed up with and kind of learning to work within a new environment, that extension of the protection for your data really becomes even more critical and quite honestly expands a lot of what needs to be looked at. So as we go from data security, I also want to then transition into information security. And when we're talking about information security, really there's a lot of key principles, and I don't profess to be an expert in any of these, but I will tell you, some of the just basic core rudimentary things that you want to be looking at. Again, a self-review. Look at your own systems, look at your own programs and your own information security program, and ask yourself that all-important question. How strong is your current ISP? Do you have the appropriate end-user access user guidelines and access use guidelines, AUGs? Those are the policies that pretty much dictate what your employees can do on your computers, your workstations. What do you want to have locked down to protect your environment? A lot of companies will, right out of the gate, social media sites, e-commerce sites, nope, those are not going to happen. Our colleagues are not going to be able to hit those types of sites while on corporate or company assigned devices. Then we get into the big one. And this, if I could throw 10 stars around this, put it in a bracket, and make it shine with gold, software updates and patches. And we'll get into it a little bit deeper, and we'll definitely hear about this again, but the timeliness and the policy around making sure that software updates and patching is completed timely when it becomes available, and you have the right switches turned on, that can really make or break whether or not your company is exposed and sees some level of a breach down the road. So if you take nothing away from my babbling here today, understand the importance of updating and patching your software. Vendor management, simply put, it's the old adage. You're only as strong as the weakest link. You want to make sure you have an understanding. If you have vendors that also deal with some of your corporate data, you want to make sure that you have an understanding and a good solid foundation of how they treat that data. How is it encrypted? What do they do with it? How do they roll it off? How long do they maintain your data? Things of that nature. Very, very critical. That kind of rolls right into the data classification and retention. Classify data, understanding how long you want to keep that data, and quite honestly, we do not want to keep data longer than we have to. For legal purposes, regulatory purposes, whatever the case might be, you want to make sure you have a good grip on that. Prime examples of that would be like the TJX breach and lessons learned from some of the larger breaches that have happened across the country and globally. And one of the biggest lessons learned, quite honestly, was a lot of the data that was stolen was, for all intents and purposes, old data that they should not have been retaining. And that further expands expanded that level of exposure for those companies. Password requirements and guidelines, you want to have a very strong understanding and a strong approach when it comes to, corporate level passwords, but they also need to be realistic. And the other big key component, whether we're talking about data security, information security, just fraud awareness in general, employee awareness training. Everybody is a part of the key to the success of a company when it comes to fraud awareness, information security, data security. And that really starts with the foundation of solid training. All employees have a part to play in maintaining a strong information security program, strong data security, payment security. The colleagues are at the heart of everything the company does. I'm a firm believer in that. And the more education, and it's not a one and done. That's the other thing I definitely want to make sure is understood. Training, when it comes to awareness training, is not a one and done. It needs to be repetitive, and it needs to be timely and accurate with up-to-date information. What's the latest and greatest? Your employees need to be aware of that. So as we start to go through some of the more notable breaches and things like that, we'll go to the next slide. And this is just an example. And with a lot of the things that are on here, these are some staggering numbers overall. I mean, the Quest Diagnostics breach, 24 million records. I'm not going to bore everybody and just read off the slide, but these are, again, a lot of top companies, a lot of well-known companies that have had to go through breaches in some levels of exploit against their companies. And quite honestly, and I think I've got this on another slide, but these are the types of lists that you do not want to see your company on. And the steps that are taken today can prevent this from being the future. So, large and small companies, as we start to talk about the types of attack vectors, and I know a lot of people hear about phishing, a lot of people hear about business email compromise. We're going to talk about a number of these, but really, from an overall company perspective, you want to be aware of all of the different angles and all of the different lenses that fraud can come at a company from, whether it be the insider approach, the ever-inclusive business email compromise, account takeovers, the ATOs, ACH fraud, check, data breach, phishing, ransomware, and malware. Those three really could be all in one bucket to themselves. They're a rather large, ugly animal that everybody needs to be prepared for and defend against. So we're going to talk about some of those, and what I want to do is also talk about the cybercrime growth as it pertains to industry, and a lot of these numbers are just absolutely huge, and I pull these from a lot of open source locations, a lot of federal agencies, federal reporting on a lot of these different numbers that are reported here today. So as you look at this, 91% of cyber attacks begin from phishing emails. And those phishing emails, those are the emails that contain the malicious links. Those are the emails that contain the malware and ultimately can lead directly to a ransomware situation. And ransomware, quite honestly, has been kind of front and foremost on a lot of the news lately. A lot more companies are experiencing ransomware, and it's not just in the corporate industry. A lot of governmental agencies, both state, local, and federal, have also been targets of ransomware attacks. So these types of attacks, whether you're talking about the insider all the way to the ransomware level, these can affect anybody at any size at any time. It's all based on vulnerability, how open you put yourselves, and what you're not protecting. So as we kind of carry forward, some of the losses in the costs of fraud can be absolutely staggering. Again, these numbers, one of the biggest one is expected cost of organizations from ransomware in 2020 is anticipated to be $11.5 billion. That is astronomical. And the average cost of a data breach globally is $3.6 million. That's globally. A lot of the research and a lot of the statistics that I had seen actually represented that in the United States, that cost is actually about 25% higher on a large corporate level data breach. So I want to hit real quickly on the business email compromise. That's one that a lot of companies see. That's in the news a lot, and there's a lot of different variations to it. And quite simply, the things you want to do is you want to have solid process in place from the accounts payable end. You want to build in multi-layered approvals, multi-layer authentication where you can, and again, training and awareness. And it's not just for the people that are handling the payment side of things. Because these attacks come in through email, they can filter in your email system, and anybody can wind up getting hacked in, even at the lowest levels on a company, and then they can work their way into a system and gain the insight they need to the overall corporate environment, what's going on. So some of the key principles that we get into basically defend against business email: establish and enforce verification procedures such as multi-factor authentication. You always want to monitor the information that you have facing the public externally, what is also referred to as being open source. A lot of that information can be used against the company, even though the company has all the proper intentions, great intentions of having that information out there, external, open source, front-facing. You want to be cautious what you're putting out in the open from a corporate perspective. And again, regular employee training, definitely awareness around social engineering tactics, fake websites and rogue links and emails, and not to be clicking on things from a phishing perspective. So, and then finally, for this portion of my presentation, malware and software, really these are those little bugs, if you will, that are contained inside of the links in the emails that an employee could click on, and the email that they're clicking on could look very legitimate, it could look authentic, and have something to do with the business that they're in. They click on that link, it exploits their system, the malware is downloaded, and then it can lead into a ransomware situation if somebody's able to actually get into the network and start moving laterally through a network. And that's where information is ultimately further exploited, locked down. The ransomware attacks occur, and then it's everything from there is just reactive and hopefully being identified early on. So precautions and defensive measures, really when it comes to defending against a lot of these things that we've gone over, it comes down to I'll hit the key factors: strong firewalls, system updates and patching. I said we'd see that again, and here it is. Two-factor authentication, up-to-date information and security protocols, strong data security, data hygiene, information security hygiene, and continuous training and awareness for all levels of your corporation and your company. I can't emphasize that enough. So ways to protect your business. Really, it's focused on employee wellness, and this is really in the COVID-19 environment. Focus on employee wellness, that is first and foremost. Planning for staffing changes with all the different scenarios that a lot of companies have seen. You need to really be aware of, what your staffing resources look like, who do you have available for, whatever tasks need to be done. Organized contact information. You want to make sure that you've got up-to-date listings of all of your colleagues, their email addresses, phone numbers, contacts. And that doesn't just pertain to employees either. That's also on the vendor side, and that's just good practice. Communicate with your customers and suppliers. Open communication, constant communication. Acknowledging the challenges that we all face and what you're doing to reduce the risk to anybody who visits your site. And that's also important. And then we talk about the billing and payments. Payments may slow down due to a whole host of reasons due to the disruptions caused by the pandemic. You want to be cognizant of those and make sure that, again, open lines of communication. Thinking about cash flow. adequate financial resources to manage potentially challenging times, especially what we're all going through right now. It is very, very critical from a financial liquidity sense. Consider security. Of course, in my world, always consider security. That's first and foremost always on my mind. So, and that goes back to all of the previous slides that we've already discussed. So the next couple of slides we'll get into here is really it's warning that was posted out by CISA, and these slides will be available after this event as well. Definitely worth taking a look at, and really it comes down to awareness and educating your colleagues, and this goes beyond just the work environment also. It really goes into, translating into personal life as well, on personal devices. You want to be cautious what you're clicking on. The number of rogue emails that are out there that are COVID-19 related are absolutely staggering right now. We see alerts on them every single day. So be vigilant, take the precautions, use caution with email attachments, the social engineering, the phishing schemes. There's a lot of legitimate sites out there that are great resources, the government websites, whether it's CISA, whether it's the FBI.gov, Department of Homeland Security, I could go on and on. So one of the other key things is when we're talking about, if we can advance from here, is charity. Whether it's a corporate level charity and you're looking to donate to something as a business or even as an individual, there is, again, staggering numbers of just absolute bogus charity sites out there, and people are just giving money over to them without doing any level of research. And the research is very, very simple to do. If you see charity, look it up. There's plenty of other ways to look up that charity, make sure it's legitimate, authentic. You also want to be aware of how much of the money that you're donating is actually going to the program that you're looking to support. So, again, another good slide, good warning, something worth sharing out with all other employees as well. So I know I'm kind of coming close on time here. And as we talk about COVID-19 and, everybody working from home now, there are concerns from a corporate security standpoint that I like to point out is personal home networks. You want to be, again, this is why having a very solid foundation when it comes to information security, data security, and you've got the proper hygiene, it kind of lessens some of the concerns around these issues. But insider threats, BYOD and IoT devices, system level access, and that's one I didn't hit on enough, but other things you want to keep in mind is you want to have the least amount of provisioning to systems that are needed by employees in order to get the work done. You don't want to have people that are just highly over-accessed, over-privileged when it comes to systems and data, and you want to keep a real firm grasp around that and the environmental unknowns. So I could go into each one of those respectively in some lengthy detail. That pretty much wraps it up for me, and I know we're going to have questions at the end of this, and so for now I'll turn it back over to Matt.
Great, thanks, John, and lots of good information there. So if we go onto the next slide, not to, as if John didn't already give you enough good numbers, we'll throw out a few more. From the 2019 AFP Payments Fraud Survey, I think the thing that jumped out to me on this slide is that we're all targets, right? I don't want to take the chance that I'm going to be in the 18% of organizations that do not get targeted. And we have noted here that fraud from checks and wires are declining. But if we flip to the next slide, we see that checks are still, the driving force behind fraud and the overwhelming numbers. And I think what this shows is that over time, in addition to continuing targeting checks, the fraudsters have evolved and diversified across all payment types. And as John did mention, in cases of business email compromise, wire transfer is the most popular choice in terms of requesting for payment. So let's get into a little bit of the, diving a little more specifically into the individual payment types and what businesses can do to help protect themselves. And we'll start with just general, and I think John covered some of this as well, just general best practices at a higher level before we get into the individual payment types. Starting with segregate accounts by function, you can isolate exposure and make it easier to identify anomalies if you have accounts that are collections versus disbursements or check versus ACH. The next one is very important. Monitor and reconcile daily, constantly. When you look for unauthorized and suspicious transactions, and investigate and report immediately anything that doesn't look right. Can't emphasize that enough. And then finally, segregation of duties. Ensure that, the person who is doing the check run isn't the person making the positive pay decisions, for example. So if we go to the next slide, talk a little bit about online banking. So the sort of window into the payment services is typically commercial online banking. And today's commercial online banking systems offer very robust security and admin features, and it's important to try to take advantage of those to the extent that is practical for the business. One thing that I'll highlight is as a huge area of concern is any situation where there is a single user that can create and release payments. So that is definitely one to watch out for, and we'll talk more about that. But as John mentioned, make sure you know what your users have access to. Limit the user permissions so that they can do their job and nothing more than that. That you're not giving out more access than you need to. And also make sure you're leveraging transaction limits and setting them appropriate to the job. You might feel more comfortable with a higher limit for repetitive wires, for example, than you would for one-off or free-form wires. The other thing I'd say on the slide, and John mentioned it earlier, is malware detection. Very important to run a system like IBM Trustee Rapport, for example, that Citizens makes available to our customers, that is designed specifically to look for malware as a subset of antivirus. And then finally on this slide, I would say alerts is important. There's, very robust alerts available that can give you a text or an email about all types of different activities that are happening in your account and might be able to provide an early warning in addition to reminders to just get things done. Okay, on to the next slide. So we talked about the best practices with online account monitoring and account reconciliation. The online banking services will help you do that, and the limits in the user access incredibly important. Next, let's talk a little bit about check fraud. Still very prevalent in the U.S. Checks are still very prevalent in the U.S., and the losses total in the billions. So let's talk a little bit about how we prevent that on the next slide. So the first recommendation I have is stop writing checks. And I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek because the U.S. is still very dependent on checks. But I do think that this whole situation that we've been in with the pandemic has really illustrated the sort of concerns around checks, physical things that people have to be in physical locations to handle. And that's not just you as the originator of the check or the, or the payer of the check, but it has to go through, the U.S. Postal Service. It has to be handled by somebody at an office or picked up at a P.O. box. There might be, if there's a lockbox service on the other end, there's couriers, there's a physical lockbox operation. All of it in a global pandemic with an infectious disease is fragile. So it's yet another kind of reason to consider, start, or most likely in the case of folks on the phone, accelerate initiatives to move paper-based payments to electronic, whether it's card and, grabbing that rebate, ACH, lower cost, no postage, or leveraging a payment network. And the other thing I noticed is that real-time payments is coming, and I think that will be a game changer in terms of the ability to move check to electronic. But anyway, regarding the checks, to the extent that they still need to be issued, absolutely consider using Pay Positive Pay. It is the best way to protect your checks from fraud, and then some of the other things we've mentioned in terms of daily reconciliation, segregation of duties, etc. But Positive Pay, if they essentially tell the bank what checks you wrote, and as they come in, we'll make sure that you wrote them, that you told us you wrote them. And if you didn't, if anything is wrong, the dollar amount, the payee, the date, if any of that isn't accurate, we'll flag it. And then you can make a decision about should it be paid or should it be returned. It might be legitimate and you just forgot to tell us, or it might be a fraud item. So Pay Positive Pay is the single best preventative measure for check fraud. On the next slide, talk about wires a little bit. As previously mentioned, wires are the preferred payment method in business email compromise because they are very hard to get back. Wires, by their nature, a key property of a wire transfer is that it is irrevocable. So if a wire is sent by mistake or because somebody got duped, the only way it's coming back is if the recipient agrees to send it back. So it's very difficult to get wires back, and because wires move so fast, especially domestically, oftentimes they've been received at the mule bank and moved on from there, probably overseas, before the victim even realizes that the wire was not legitimate and starts to question it. So hugely important with wires to have that just extra layer of caution. And certainly with business email compromise, the email, comes from the CEO, quote unquote, saying, hey, it's an emergency and it's confidential. We're doing an acquisition. We need to wire $2 million. Don't tell anyone. Send it out right now. Always verify that out of band. A text message to the owner or a phone call or some sort of out of band verification can prevent a lot of hassle when it comes to business email compromise. Next slide on wire fraud. There's lots of ways to try to make the system safer, whether it's wires are being initiated by phone or whether they're being initiated online. Certainly, for phone-based wires, leveraging PINs and callbacks are ways to ensure dual control and the right level of authorization. And then if online, absolutely positively recommend dual user create and release, meaning the person who creates the wire transfer cannot release it. The most often when phishing works, one person in the company who has the ability to create and release a payment gets tricked. And it's so much less successful when that one person cannot actually release the payment, because it's much harder for the fraudsters to find and trick two people than it is to trick one. So incredibly important for dual user create release. And then some of the other things we've mentioned, segregated roles, which plays into that. Most all commercial online platforms now have multi-factor authentication, which is a password and some sort of token, using alerts. And also, and we'll talk about this with ACH as well, taking it out of offline and phone and utilizing file transfers. So there's another way to get payments to the bank that does not use the internet, but does not use internet-based systems, but uses a file transfer mechanism, and it can be far more secure with the information coming out of a source system and going directly to the bank. All right, on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about ACH. I do just want to spend a moment on ACH because there are two different things that happen with ACH, and they're both important. The first and most common ACH fraud is unauthorized ACH debits. So, every company out there that issues checks has an account number, out on the street that's, for most intents and purposes, easily available, and it has the account number and the routing number printed right on the check. And people can use that to have debits fraudulently taken out of the account. I remember the first one I saw in my career as a young banker, a commercial client had a car lease, a Ford car lease coming out of their account, and they didn't know what it was, and we determined somebody had used their check information, signed up for a lease, and said, debit my payment from this account, and that's what was happening. So that still remains common, and there are ways to prevent that. Services like ACH Positive Pay, essentially, much like check positive pay, you can tell the bank who you expect to debit your account, and anything else would be blocked. And then you can also, with the segregation of accounts, if you have an account that is specific for ACH debits, your other accounts you can just block debits. So no fraudulent debits could come out because you don't do any ACH debit activity from that account. And especially if you have a check issuing account, putting an ACH debit block on it can really help protect it. The other thing that can happen is utilizing ACH to push payments out in response to a business email compromise or malware and phishing. It's not generally as preferred because it's slower, and ACH is easier to get back than wire transfer is. But sometimes a customer doesn't have wire online, for example, and they do have ACH, for example. And the other thing with ACH is ACH is getting faster. Same-day ACH has existed in the U.S. for a few years now, and earlier this year, I believe it was in March, the same-day ACH limit was raised from $25,000 per transaction to $100,000 per transaction. So it's a combination of faster with higher dollar amounts, will continue to make ACH a little bit more attractive. And this is another kind of plug I'd put in for real-time payments. When real-time payments was designed, sort of a clean sheet of paper, what should a 21st century payment system look like? The concept of debits and real-time payments does not exist. You can't originate a real-time payment debit. What you can do is do a request for payment and send it to your trading partner, and your trading partner can decide whether to respond with a payment or not. So there's an ability to use real-time payments for collection, but not to debit. And a big part of that was when you're going real time, you need to be very wary of fraud. So that was a big part of the design related to real-time payments. And then finally, much like I said with wire, I would say with ACH, the ability to not even do it online, but the ability to get ACH files from the back-end systems and send them directly into the bank in a very secure connection can also help mitigate fraud and take it out of the online banking realm entirely. So with that, I think that concludes my comments on check, wire, and ACH, and I'm going to pass it over to Dave Hughes for some comments on commercial card. Dave?
Thank you, Matt, and good afternoon, folks. Matt, I'm Dave Hughes. I run the commercial card and merchant service businesses here at Citizens Bank. So thank you very much for your time today. I'd just like to start by echoing, some of the comments that John made at the start. Unfortunately, bad actors and fraudsters do use chaotic and abnormal times like this to exploit. And I think a lot of the best practices and general guidelines that John mentioned are key for you all to safeguard your business through these times. And also provide a really kind of strong framework for a more specific analysis of your payment principles, some of which Matt ran through. And I'll touch on some points from a card perspective now. So, similar to Matt's comments with ACH, commercial card is another means to move away from higher risk paper payments and activity in general. Matt's slide alluded to the attempted percentage of fraud per product group when card is way down, especially on the virtual card side, which I'll talk about later. But overall, I just want to touch on some very high-level best practices in relation to card and how you can minimize fraud. Whether it's making payments with card or accepting it. The first point I would make, and it's a very general point, but we do have, dedicated fraud and product experts. And as you are setting up a card program, I think it's key that you have an initial discussion with our team and ensuring where possible the fraud parameters and controls that we're putting in place are very much aligned with your internal fraud policy and business practices. Ideally this would be done at the start of the, as we're setting up the card program, but can be done at any time, right? And can always be updated and enhanced. So if that's not something you've done with your treasury relationship manager or card specialist in the recent past, I would suggest using COVID as an example to have that discussion. Just be aware of the controls overall that we're doing on your behalf, the monitoring that we're doing, and make sure where possible it's aligned with your overall fraud policy. A big part of that is reporting, right? We have a lot of reporting in our card applications that can be personalized to an extent. Reports looking at fraud from a merchant perspective, from a transaction perspective. I think overall with fraud, the earlier the identification, the more effective we can be to preventing it. And so reporting and real-time alerts are critical and in most cases can be personalized to your individual needs. Just looking at the macro card environment a bit, the U.S. overall was slower to the party in terms of EMV adoption, but over the past couple of years, that's become more and more of the standard in the U.S. market. I think I read somewhere that over 80% of transactions are now EMV compliant. So from a card present perspective, EMV is a primary tool to reducing fraud, and I think it has resulted in a huge reduction in card present fraud overall. So that's something that should be a standard service that you're receiving with your bank, but please make sure that's the case, and always, particularly from an acquiring perspective, make sure you are fully compliant from an EMV perspective. With the growth in EMV and the growth in overall online card activity, fraudsters have turned their attention to card not present transactions, web, mobile, over-the-phone type payments. It's critical, 80% of our transactions are actually card not present today, so that's by far our biggest avenue for how our clients are making payments today. And it's critical that you talk to your bank around what you can do, the parameters that you can put in place to protect yourself against fraud for card not present transactions. A lot of what's being done in this space is led by the card associations and is done on your behalf, but it's still very much in the early stages and something it's vitally important that you're aware of and mitigating the risk where possible. Just touching on a few topics specific to the issuing or payable side, by no means a comprehensive list, but just a few things that I'd like to make you aware of today. When you're making payments with a card, the big thing that I would push on the issuing side is the growth of virtual cards. By far the fastest growing e-payables instrument. Virtual cards follow the same flow of a traditional card transaction, but replace static numbers with tokenized numbers, so a lot less susceptible to fraud from that perspective. They also come with a formal dollar amount and expiration date, which again make them a lot harder from a fraud perspective. So our virtual card product is called Access AP Card. If that's something you're not using today, and fraud is a concern of yours, I would absolutely recommend having a discussion on that side. In partnership with that, we offer a wide range of controls around merchant category codes. For instance, if you open up a card and it's purely for T&E purposes, limit the merchants that card can be used to pay. Limited to airlines, limited to hotels, etc. So that's another key control that you should absolutely be focused and considering. And then lastly, fraud is constantly evolving. I think John touched on this in his segment. But we're constantly looking at new ways that we can address fraud attacks in the market. As an example, we came out with a project earlier in the year where all new cards will come out with a randomized card account number rather than the sequential card number, which makes it a lot less susceptible to credit master attacks. That's just one example, but we're constantly looking at bringing out new solutions and enhancements that will combat fraud. Just a couple of things to pick out on the acquiring side. If you're accepting card payments, obviously comes with an element of fraud risk as well. Payment card industry provides a requirement, a set of standard requirements around the processing, storing, and transmitting of card data. So you should ensure your acquirer is supporting you in compliance with that, and it's everything from an annual assessment to make sure your requirements are all up to date, etc. Point-to-point encryption and tokenization should be kind of standard in most of the solutions that you are either doing or considering on a client perspective. But again, make sure these are topics that you are aware of, talking to your partner about, and making sure you are using them to minimize the potential of fraud. And then the last thing I would kind of mention, again, as we try to evolve and make sure we're mitigating against potential new fraud trends, banks are looking to bring out more kind of leading-edge solutions, marrying together the analyzing of fraud data with machine learning and analytics teams, dedicated fraud teams. We've come to market with a solution, FraudSight, which is an example of this. If fraud is very much an area of concern on the acquiring side, that's absolutely a solution that you should talk to your relationship manager or salesperson about. It's just an added value-add area that can combat fraud. So that's some very high-level thoughts from the card perspective. Obviously, if there are anything in here of interest or just a general discussion on fraud, we'd be happy to take that forward on a case-by-case basis. So with that, I think we're going to pass it over to questions. So operator, I'll pass it back to you, and thank you everyone for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, please press 1 then 0 on your phone. If you're using a speakerphone, please lift the handset before pressing the numbers. Once again, if you have a question or comment, please press 1 then 0.
John, Matt, and Dave, thank you for the presentation. A lot of good information there in some short time. While we're waiting for questions in the queue, we did have a couple come in via email, so I'd like to toss them out to you. John, this first one is probably most directed to you. The question is, are there any recent fraud trends that you would want to highlight to the group on the phone today?
Sure, and I think this kind of plays in part of what Matt was discussing about, the potential of a transition of ACH becoming more of a payment vector for business email compromise. I will say, albeit, business email compromise predominantly is still conducted with the transfer of funds via wire. We are seeing kind of a parallel shift with the utilization of ACH payments being requested instead of wire. So, again, that kind of drives, making sure that you're protected on multiple levels within the payment industry, whether you're talking wire and ACH or checks. You want to make sure that you're protected wherever you can be, especially as things transition from one preferred method to another. I don't see wire being completely off the board and going away as a method of BEC funds transfer. I just see them utilizing ACH more and more as another attack vector, if you will. So I just wanted to make sure we share that out.
And John, it's Matt. I think that's a really good point, and just sort of illustrates the broader reality that payments around the world, and certainly here in the U.S., are getting faster. Everybody's used to, Zelle and Venmo, and hey, you just sent it on your phone, and here it is popping up on my phone. And that's the expectation, and that's what payments are being built towards. So, as I mentioned, ACH has gotten faster, going from what was always a next day settlement to a same day settlement option now with higher dollar amounts. Real-time payments exists today and can reach about 50% of the checking accounts in the United States with the banks that are currently live. And the Federal Reserve has announced that they're going to build a faster payments network called FedNow that they think will go live in 2023 or 2024. So faster payments are absolutely coming, and with that is, just underscores the need for vigilance around payments.
Well said.
Excellent points, both. Are any questions in the queue?
And as a reminder to the phone lines, if you have a question or comment, please press 1, then 0.
Okay, perhaps the audience is more inclined to email them, because I actually have a couple more here, and the business email compromise seems to be a topic of interest. And John, I'm going to toss this one also to you. The question is, what steps does Citizens Bank take to recover funds for clients that have been a victim of business email compromise?
Well, I'm actually glad I got to hit on this one. My slides didn't necessarily cover it, but one of the things I'm very proud of from the Citizens angle is we do go to the extreme when it comes to recovering funds on behalf of our clients. And part of our process is, again, and a lot of it's dollar-driven and, thresholds within the FBI, but we utilize what's known as the kill chain process. And if we have a client that's been victimized, and when we're talking about BEC events, we're really talking about that 24 to 48-hour time period, which is the golden time frame for recovery of funds. We immediately engage the FBI, both on the phone as well as through the IC3 portal for the FBI, and gain their assistance in working directly through FinCEN, who helps go out on our behalf to reach out to another FI to lock that money down. And at the same time that's going on, we also are in direct contact with a destination beneficiary account and institution requesting the funds be locked down. We provide hold harmless letters in situations of fraud on behalf of our clients to get that money back. And in a lot of cases, I will tell you, we have even gone beyond just that initial beneficiary account, where money's gone from, 1 layer to 2 layer to 3 layers. we'll go to that extreme wherever we can to recover and recoup funds for our clients.
Excellent. Thanks, John. Before we go back to the queue, I have one more here on the emails. Matt, this is probably most suited to you. The question is, if somebody tries to use my account information for a fraudulent ACH debit, won't the bank catch that?
Yeah, that's a good question and a common, I would say, misconception. And so the answer is no. Really, all ACH needs is a valid account number and a routing number. And if a debit or credit is presented against valid banking credentials, the account number and the routing number, it will go through, short of some protection on that particular account, like ACH positive pay. And the reason behind that is ACH is a bulk payment system. It's very high volume of typically low value payments. So those individual payments do not get interrogated nearly to the degree, say, of wire transfers. So in the case that I mentioned earlier, that Ford car lease was a person, and it was, and I believe the person was in Texas or something, and the ACH debit was hitting, a commercial account here in Massachusetts, and, it went through fine because it was a legitimate routing and account number. So, you can't rely on that being caught because the person who's authorizing the debit isn't the name on the account. You really have to, be vigilant and watch for those types of transactions.
Very good. Thanks, Matt. If you show we're at 229, Art, was anything in the queue?
I'll give another reminder, though. If you have a question or comment, please press 1 then 0 for question or comment. And no one has queued up. Please continue.
Very good. So, Matt, I don't know, you want to wrap that up?
Yeah, I think that allows us to wrap up right on time. So just want to thank everyone for dialing in. Thank our speakers, John and Dave, for doing a great job. I hope people found this valuable. It is, timely. Fraud is always timely, and now in times like these more so than ever. So I hope everyone found it valuable and can utilize the information. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance.